The old, oak tree that stood sentinel in the schoolyard had seen countless seasons come and go. Its leaves, a vibrant tapestry of amber and crimson, rustled softly in the gentle autumn breeze, each whisper a secret passed down through the years. It was under the watchful branches of this very tree that Grace often found herself during lunch breaks, seeking a solitude that the bustling staff room could not provide. For Grace, silence had become a companion, a blanket she wrapped around herself to ward off the chill of a grief that was still, even after 6 months, startlingly fresh. Her life in the city felt like a story someone else had written. A story of noise, of frantic energy, of bright lights that did little to illuminate the growing emptiness inside her. The car accident that had taken her parents had not just stolen their lives, it had stolen the colors from her own world, muting everything to a dull, aching gray. And so, she had returned to the one place that still held echoes of a happier time, her family's hometown, a place where the streets were named after trees and everyone knew your business, for better or worse. The little house she'd inherited felt too big without her mother's laughter in the kitchen, too quiet without her father's old records playing in the living room. She had come here simply to breathe, to remember how to exist without the constant, crushing weight on her chest. The teaching job at the local elementary school had been a surprise, an offer extended by a kindly principal who remembered her as a bright-eyed little girl. Grace had accepted, not out of passion, but out of a desperate need for structure, for a reason to get out of bed each morning. But a strange thing began to happen within the four walls of her classroom. Surrounded by the uncomplicated honesty of children, their faces eager and full of light, the ice around her heart began to thaw, just a little. She found herself smiling at their silly jokes, feeling a genuine warmth when they grasped a new concept. It was here, in this small room smelling of crayons and chalk dust, that she first began to feel like a person again, and not just a vessel for sorrow. Among the 20 bright faces in her class, one stood out, not for its noise, but for its quietness. Arya. A little girl with hair the color of dark chocolate and eyes that seemed to see far more than a 6-year-old should. She was a sweet child, always polite, always with her work completed neatly, but there was a wariness to her, a hesitation, as if she were constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. She rarely spoke of her home life, and on the rare occasions she did, it was only of her father. Her mother was a ghost, a subject never mentioned. And then there was the father himself. Dante. The man was a rumor given flesh and bone. He was never early, never late, but always arrived precisely at 3:15 p.m. in a sleek, black car that seemed to absorb the sunlight. He never came to the classroom door. Instead, he would wait by the gate, a tall, imposing figure usually flanked by one or two other serious-looking men whose eyes were always moving, always scanning. The other parents would give him a wide berth, their conversations hushing as he passed, their glances a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The whispers in the town were a constant, low hum. They spoke of his power, of his wealth, of things done in the shadows. "He's not a man you cross," the lady at the grocery store had once murmured to Grace, her voice full of grim warning. "Your father, God rest his soul, would have told you to steer clear. Men like that, they live in a world angels fear to tread." Grace had taken the advice to heart. She made sure her interactions with him were strictly professional, limited to a brief, polite nod at the end of the day as Arya ran to him. He would acknowledge her with a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head, his expression an unreadable mask. His eyes, a shade of brown so dark they were nearly black, would sweep over her, and she would feel a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. He was handsome, in a sharp, dangerous way that felt like the edge of a knife, beautiful, but you knew it could cut you. She felt a pang of sympathy for little Arya, growing up in the shadow of such a cold, intimidating man. The sky had been a flat, iron gray all day, the air heavy with the promise of rain. By the time the final bell rang, the first drops were beginning to fall, fat and heavy, splattering against the classroom windows. Grace supervised the usual chaotic exodus, helping zipper coats and reminding children to check for their homework folders. One by one, they were collected by parents wielding colorful umbrellas, until the noise faded and the classroom was left in a sudden, profound quiet. All except for one small figure, sitting patiently on the reading rug, her backpack neatly placed beside her. It was Arya. Grace checked the clock. 3:30 p.m. Then 3:45 p.m. The rain was now sheeting down, rattling the window panes and turning the world outside into a watery blur. Dante was never late. A flicker of concern ignited within her. She tried the phone number on file, but it went straight to a generic voicemail. She watched Arya, who was trying very hard to look brave, but her lower lip had begun to tremble just slightly as the empty minutes stretched on. The school secretary had already left for a dentist appointment, and the janitor was busy on the far side of the building. They were alone. Grace made a decision. She couldn't leave this little girl waiting in a dark, empty school. She wouldn't. "Come on, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'll give you a ride home." Arya's eyes widened with a mixture of surprise and relief. Grace bundled her into her own modest, slightly old sedan, the interior a comforting contrast to the storm raging outside. She programmed the address from the school files into her phone. It wasn't far, just on the outskirts of town, up on the hill that overlooked the valley. The drive was tense, the windshield wipers working furiously to clear the downpour, the world a smear of grays and greens. When they finally turned onto the long, private road, Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. The mansion, there was no other word for it, was less a home and more a fortress. A high, wrought iron gate, tipped with what looked suspiciously like fleur-de-lis spikes, barred the entrance. Two men stood in a small, sheltered guardhouse, their forms silhouetted against the dim light. As Grace's car approached, one of them stepped out, holding up a hand, his face impassive beneath a large black umbrella. Grace rolled down her window, the cold, wet air rushing in. "I'm Arya's teacher," she said, her voice sounding small against the drumming rain. "She was left at school. I'm bringing her home." The guard leaned down, his eyes scanning the car's interior, lingering on Arya in the backseat before returning to Grace. He gave a curt nod and without a word, the massive iron gates began to swing inward, silent and smooth. The driveway was long, winding through meticulously manicured gardens that were now being lashed by the storm. The house itself was a masterpiece of stone and glass, modern and severe, with lights glowing warmly from within, yet it projected an aura of impenetrability. Grace pulled up to the grand front entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was a mistake. This felt like crossing a line she was never meant to cross. But it was too late to turn back now. The heavy, rain-spattered car door closed with a soft thud, a sound that felt insignificantly small against the imposing grandeur of the stone and glass facade that loomed above them. Grace's hand, chilled by the cold dampness of the autumn storm, found Arya's smaller, warmer one, and together they hurried up the broad, shallow steps to the shelter of the vast portico. Before Grace could even raise a finger to find a bell, one of the double doors, made of a rich, dark wood that seemed to swallow the light, swung inward without a sound. A man, dressed in a simple, impeccably tailored black suit, stood there. He wasn't one of the guards from the gate. He was older, his hair silvered at the temples, his posture erect but not aggressive. His eyes, a calm and assessing gray, moved from Arya's relieved face to Grace's undoubtedly nervous one. "Miss Grace," he said, his voice a low, cultured baritone that held no surprise. "I am Silas. Please, come in out of the weather. We were alerted to your arrival." He stepped aside, granting them entry into a foyer so vast and echoing that the patter of their wet shoes on the polished marble floor seemed to travel for miles. The air inside was cool and carried a faint, clean scent of lemon polish and something else, something unidentifiable and expensive. The space was breathtaking in its minimalist beauty. A sweeping staircase curved gracefully to an upper floor, a single, modern sculpture of twisted metal stood in the center, and enormous windows, now streaked with racing raindrops, offered a blurred view of the storm-swept gardens. But for all its beauty, the house felt profoundly empty, a beautifully crafted shell devoid of the comforting clutter of a lived-in home. There were no scattered shoes by the door, no family photographs on the stark walls, no faint smell of something cooking in the kitchen. It was a place of perfect order, and its silence was deafening. "Papa isn't home yet?" Arya asked, her small voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space, her hand still clinging tightly to Grace's. Silas's expression softened almost imperceptibly when he looked at the child. "He is concluding business, little one. He was unexpectedly delayed. He will be here shortly." His gaze returned to Grace. "You are very kind to have brought her home. We apologize for the inconvenience. The men assigned to pick up today encountered an unforeseen complication." He did not elaborate, and the unspoken words hung in the air, adding to the weight of the strange atmosphere. "If you would care to wait, I can have some tea brought for you. I am sure Mr. Vescari will wish to thank you personally." Grace's instinct was to refuse, to flee this beautiful, unsettling place and return to the comforting, familiar confines of her small house. But a combination of politeness and a nagging, pricking curiosity rooted her to the spot. She had seen the monster from the safety of the schoolyard fence, now she was standing in its lair. Just for a moment, she heard herself say, her own voice sounding thin and reedy, I should really be going soon." Silas gave a single, slow nod and gestured toward a long, low bench made of the same dark wood as the door. As you wish. Please, make yourself comfortable. I will inform Mr. Vescari of your presence. With that, he turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound on the marble, disappearing through an arched doorway that led deeper into the house's shadowy interior. Left alone with Arya, Grace sat on the edge of the bench, her back straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Arya, seemingly comforted by her teacher's presence, leaned against her, a small, warm weight. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, listening to the muffled fury of the storm outside and the heavy, rhythmic ticking of a giant clock she couldn't see. Her eyes wandered the room, taking in the clean lines, the absence of personal effects, the sheer, intimidating scale of it all. It was then that her gaze fell upon a door to her left, set into the wall opposite the staircase. It was not quite closed, left ajar by a mere inch or two, a sliver of yellow light spilling out onto the cool grey marble. From within that sliver of light, she heard voices. They were low, male, and urgent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably tense, a current of controlled aggression running beneath the surface. It was the polar opposite of the dead silence in the foyer. Driven by an impulse she would later struggle to explain, Grace found herself standing, her feet carrying her softly, silently, a few steps closer to that tantalizing crack in the door. She told herself she was just moving to look at the abstract sculpture, to appear occupied, but her entire being was focused on that narrow opening. She peered through the gap. The room beyond was a library or a study, lined with shelves of leather-bound books. But the scene within was not one of scholarly peace. A group of men, 5 or 6 of them, were gathered around a large, round table. Their postures were rigid, their faces hard. And on the table, illuminated by a single, stark overhead light, were things that stole the breath from her lungs. There were maps, not of countries, but of the city and its outskirts, marked with precise, angry red circles. There were stacks of cash, bound tightly, lying in careless piles like building blocks. And there, lying next to a sheaf of papers, was the cold, dark, metallic gleam of a gun. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. The whispers were true. Every fearful word spoken in hushed tones at the grocery store, every wary glance from the other parents, it was all real. This was not just a powerful man, this was a dangerous one. Her eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and morbid fascination, found the center of the room, the focal point of all the tense energy. It was Dante. He was standing, his back mostly to her, one hand resting on the table, the other gesturing with a sharp, final motion as he spoke. His voice, though still low, carried a chilling authority, a tone that brooked no argument. It was the voice of a man who was used to being obeyed, a man for whom words were commands. This was the reality of him, stripped of the distant, polished facade he presented at the school gate. And then, as if he had felt the weight of her horrified gaze, he stopped speaking mid-sentence. His shoulders stiffened. Slowly, deliberately, he began to turn his head. His dark eyes, sharp and penetrating, swept across the room and locked directly with hers through that 1-inch gap. Time seemed to stop. The air vanished from her lungs. In that single, paralyzing moment, she saw not the cold, intimidating father, but the ruthless core of the man they all feared. His expression didn't change, but his gaze held hers, pinning her in place, and in its depths, she saw a flash of something, surprise, perhaps, or assessment, or a warning. It lasted only a heartbeat before the door was pushed firmly shut from the inside by an unseen hand, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot in the silent foyer, severing the connection and plunging her back into the terrifying reality of her situation. She was alone in the house of a wolf, and she had just looked it directly in the eyes. The drive home from the mansion was a blur of streaking rain and frantic windshield wipers, doing little to calm the storm inside Grace's mind. Her hands were clenched white on the steering wheel, every nerve raw. The image was burned behind her eyelids, the maps, the cash, the gun, and most of all, the way Dante's eyes had found hers through the crack in the door. It wasn't anger she saw, but something more unsettling, a deep, calculating stillness, an absolute control. He hadn't looked away, he had held her gaze, acknowledging her intrusion with a look that felt like a brand. A restless night followed. The comforting silence of her own home now felt oppressive, the memory of the mansion's sterile lemon scent replacing the familiar fragrance of her mother's roses. She replayed the moment endlessly, the chill of the marble, Arya's small weight against her, the final click of the latch. She had crossed a line. Fear was a cold stone in her stomach. What would he do? The evidence of his world had been laid bare. A primal part of her screamed to hide, yet another part, dormant since her parents' death, hummed with a strange, unwelcome thrill. She had stared into the heart of the danger, and she had not looked away. The next morning, the world was washed clean under a pale sun. The school day began with its usual chaos, but Grace moved on autopilot, her smile brittle. Every time the classroom door opened, her heart lurched, expecting Silas or another stern man with a warning. The morning dragged, each minute an eternity of anticipation, her eyes constantly drifting to the window, half expecting to see the black car idling like a dark omen. When the lunch bell finally rang, the children spilled out, leaving the classroom blessedly quiet. Grace sank into her chair, releasing a shaky breath. Perhaps he would ignore it. Perhaps she was just a momentary blip, not worth his attention. The thought should have comforted her, but it left a strange hollow feeling. It was then a shadow fell across the doorway, blocking the light. He was there. Not at the gate, but at the threshold of her classroom. Dante Vescari. He filled the space completely, altering the very air. He was dressed in dark, fitted trousers and a simple black sweater, making him seem both more approachable and more intensely present. He was alone. No guards, no Silas. His dark eyes scanned the empty room, the colorful artwork, the small chairs, the lopsided ABC banner, before landing on her. There was no trace of the cold man from the study. His gaze was focused, intent, and unnervingly direct. He took a single step inside, the door clicking shut behind him. "Miss Grace," he said, his voice different. It was still that low baritone, but the metallic edge of command was gone, replaced by a smooth, deliberate calm. Grace stood up quickly, her chair scraping loudly. "Mr. Vescari. Is everything all right with Arya?" It was the only safe question she could find. "Arya is perfectly well, thank you," he replied, a faint hint of a smile not quite reaching his eyes. He took another step closer, his movements fluid. He stopped a few feet from her desk, close enough for her to see the weave of his sweater, the sharp line of his jaw. "It is you I have come to see." The directness left her speechless. "I find myself in your debt," he continued, his tone conversational. "You showed my daughter a kindness my organization failed to provide. You placed yourself in an inconvenient situation for her safety." He paused, letting the word settle. "That is not a small thing." He was thanking her. The dissonance was staggering. The man from the study felt like a nightmare, but this man felt terrifyingly real. It was no trouble, really," she stammered. "Any teacher would have done the same." "Perhaps," he conceded, studying her. "But it was you who did it." He took a final, deliberate step forward, now directly across her desk. He was so close she could smell the clean scent of his soap, sandalwood and bergamot. "I would like to thank you properly. Have coffee with me." It wasn't really a question. It was delivered with the quiet assurance of a man not used to being refused. His gaze was unwavering. The air crackled with a new tension, no longer just fear, but a dizzying, dangerous fascination. The world of crayons vanished, replaced by his intensity. Every warning bell clanged in her mind, telling her to run. But looking into his eyes, seeing the genuine intent, the word wouldn't form. The part of her that had been numb was suddenly, vibrantly awake. Her mouth felt dry. Her heart pounded with a wild, reckless curiosity. She had seen the monster, and now he was asking her for coffee. Against every shred of logic and instinct, her own voice, quiet but clear, answered. Yes. The single syllable of consent hung in the classroom air, transforming the space from a familiar sanctuary into a charged arena. Dante did not smile, but something in his gaze shifted, a subtle thawing of the ice around him. He gave a slow, single nod. "I will send a car for you at 4 o'clock, he stated, his tone leaving no room for debate. "It will be discreet." With that, he turned and left, the door closing with a soft, definitive click. The rest of the school day passed for Grace in a blur. Her body went through the motions, guiding spelling tests, reading stories, supervising art, but her mind was trapped in a dizzying loop of anticipation. The children's voices seemed distant. She watched the clock, its minute hand crawling with agonizing slowness. What had she done? The question echoed. She had agreed to coffee with a man who conducted business surrounded by weapons. This felt like stepping over a precipice. When the final bell rang, she moved through dismissal with robotic efficiency. Fleeing to the staff bathroom, she stared at her reflection. The face was pale, eyes wide with turmoil. She looked terrified but vibrantly awake. The numb haze since her parents' death had been ripped away. Splashing cold water on her face did nothing to calm the flutter in her stomach. At 4 o'clock, a sleek, silver car pulled up. The driver nodded, holding the door open. The silent ride carried her toward the hills, stopping not at the mansion, but at a small, exclusive cafe on a quiet lane. "He is waiting inside," the driver said before pulling away. Taking a deep breath, she entered. The cafe was warm, smelling of coffee and vanilla. Soft music played. Every table was empty save one. In a secluded booth, Dante stood as she approached. He pulled out her chair, his hand briefly brushing her coat, a touch so light it might have been accidental, yet it sent a jolt through her. They looked at each other across the small table. The silence was thick with unspoken questions. A waiter took their orders and vanished. "It was not my intention to frighten you," Dante began, his voice low. "I saw a world I don't understand," Grace said. "You saw a necessary part of my world," he replied evenly. "It is not gentle. Not for someone like you." He paused as coffee arrived, then continued. "But it allows me to protect what is mine. The maps you saw maintain a fragile, dangerous balance." He wasn't justifying himself, she realized. He explained his reality with a weary gravity. He asked about her life, and something in his undivided attention made her talk. Words flowed about the accident, the grief, the hollow emptiness, the peace found in her classroom. She hadn't spoken so openly in months. He listened, absorbing her pain without pity. "I, too, have known loss," he said quietly. "Arya's mother chose a path without my world's weight." The admission built a bridge between their lives. He was not just a crime lord but a single father with his own scars. Afternoon light faded. Their cups sat empty, but neither moved to leave. Conversation grew lighter. He asked about her books, her teaching, her dreams. He spoke of Arya's love for her stories. 4 hours, the dangerous man and gentle teacher vanished, replaced by a man and woman talking in a quiet cafe. Fear remained, but joined now by something more perilous, a profound connection. She was captivated by the man beneath the danger, seeing who he might have been between life's storms, making the unthinkable feel entirely inevitable. The silver car returned for her, its interior now feeling less like a cage and more like a vessel transporting her between two separate realities. The drive back to her small, quiet house was a journey through a tunnel of her own whirling thoughts. The scent of his sandalwood soap seemed to have woven itself into the fibers of her coat, a persistent, haunting reminder of his presence. The image of his face, softened in the warm light of the cafe as he spoke of his daughter, was now superimposed over the memory of his cold, commanding figure in the study. He was no longer a simple monster from a cautionary tale, he was a complex, breathing contradiction, a man who dealt in shadows to protect the one spot of light in his life. This understanding did not erase the danger, but it made it infinitely more complicated, weaving threads of empathy and a desperate, aching curiosity into the fabric of her fear. She did not sleep that night. The silence of her home, once a solace, now felt like an emptiness waiting to be filled. Her mind replayed every word, every glance, every subtle shift in his expression. The way he had listened, truly listened, as she spoke of her grief, had touched a part of her she thought had gone numb forever. It was as if he had seen the raw, wounded core of her and had not flinched away, but had simply acknowledged its existence. This was an intimacy far more profound and terrifying than any physical touch could ever be. When the first hints of dawn painted the sky in shades of lavender and rose, she was already awake, staring at the ceiling, her heart a tangled knot of anticipation and dread for the school day ahead. He was there again in the morning, not inside the school this time, but waiting by the gate as was his custom. Yet, everything was different. The simple, professional nod they usually exchanged was gone. This time, as Arya ran ahead to his car, his eyes found Grace's across the distance and held them. It was a look of intense, unspoken communication, a silent acknowledgement of the connection forged over coffee. It was a look that stripped away the pretense and the public personas, a look that was just for her. A slow, deep flush warmed her skin, and she quickly looked away, her composure shattered. The invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer just a teacher and a parent, they were accomplices in a secret, their relationship now existing in the charged space between his dangerous world and her safe one. The invitation for dinner came later that day, delivered not by a note or a phone call, but by Arya herself, her small face beaming with excitement. "Papa says will you please come to dinner with us tonight?" the little girl asked, her words tumbling out in a happy rush. "He says it's a proper thank you." The request, filtered through the innocence of his daughter, was impossible to refuse. The fear was still there, a cold whisper in the back of her mind, but it was now drowned out by a louder, more compelling urge to see him again, to step back into that intoxicating space where she felt truly, vibrantly seen. That evening, as she stood once more before the imposing mansion, the fear was a palpable thing, a cold knot in her stomach. But when Silas opened the door, his usual impassive expression was touched with something resembling approval. "They are waiting for you in the dining room, Miss Grace," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. The house felt different tonight. The cavernous foyer was no longer a cold, echoing chamber but a grand entrance to a home. There were soft lights on, and from a room down the hall, she could hear the sound of Arya's laughter, a sound so pure and joyful it seemed to disarm the very walls. The dinner was not held in some vast, formal banquet hall, but in a small, cozy breakfast nook off the kitchen, a room with a round table and a large window looking out over the now darkened gardens. The atmosphere was warm, almost normal. Dante was different here, in this domestic space. He served her food himself, his movements sure and graceful. He encouraged Arya to tell Grace about her day, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a genuine, unguarded smile as his daughter chatted away. He was not the feared ruler of a criminal empire in this moment, he was a proud, loving father, and the transformation was utterly captivating. Grace felt the last of her defenses crumbling as she watched them together, this glimpse of the family unit she had lost and secretly longed for. Later, after Arya had been tucked into bed, stories read and goodnight kisses given, Grace found herself alone with Dante in the living room. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across his face. The silence that settled between them was no longer awkward, but thick with unspoken feeling. He stood before her, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. All of this, he said, his voice a low rumble, his gesture taking in the room, the house, the world it represented. "It is a fortress. I built it to keep the world out. To keep her safe." He took a step closer, his gaze intense, searing in its honesty. "But when you are here, Grace, it does not feel like a fortress. It feels like a home. For the first time in a very, very long time, it feels like a home." He moved again, closing the small distance between them until he was standing so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see the flecks of gold in his deep brown eyes. The air crackled with a tension that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I have spent my entire life building walls," he whispered, his voice husky. "And you walked through them as if they were not even there." He raised a hand, his fingers gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek, the touch so tender it made her heart ache. "May I kiss you?" The question hung in the firelit air, a simple request that held the weight of 1,000 unspoken promises and perils. Every rational thought screamed for her to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her own world. But looking into his eyes, seeing the raw vulnerability there, the man beneath the myth laid bare, she found that safety was the last thing she desired. The numbness was gone, burned away by the heat of his gaze. The void left by her grief was being filled with something new, something terrifying and brilliant and alive. Her voice was barely a breath, a surrender and an affirmation all in one. "Yes." His lips met hers, and the world fell away. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss, but a claiming, a confession, a release of all the pent-up intensity that had been building between them since their eyes first met through a crack in a door. It was a kiss that held the darkness of his world and the promise of a heaven only he could show her, a kiss that sealed her fate and bound her to him in the space of a single, breathless moment. The world did not simply fall away, it shattered, and from its fragments, a new universe was born, one contained within the circle of Dante's arms. The kiss was not an end, but a cataclysmic beginning. It was a silent conversation that spoke of months of lonely yearning on her part and a lifetime of guarded isolation on his. It was a fusion of two opposing forces, the unyielding strength of a man who commanded empires of shadow, and the gentle, resilient light of a woman who had refused to be extinguished by grief. When they finally parted, breathless and trembling, the air in the room felt different, charged with a new, permanent energy. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, the shadows in the corners of the lavish room less menacing, as if the very house itself was sighing in relief. He did not apologize, nor did he ask if it was a mistake. He simply rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed, his breathing slowly steadying, as if he were committing the feel of her, the scent of her, to a memory he had been starving for his entire life. The following days unfolded in a dreamlike sequence, a stark and beautiful contrast to the grey monotony that had defined Grace's life for so long. Dante, the man whose time was measured in power plays and strategic decisions, now carved out vast, uninterrupted spaces in his schedule for her. Their time together was not spent in the public eye, it was hidden away, precious and private. They took long walks through the secluded paths of his estate, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet, talking about everything and nothing. He spoke of his childhood, of the pressures he inherited, of his fierce, all-consuming love for Arya that was the guiding principle of his life. In return, she found herself sharing stories of her parents she hadn't been able to speak of without crying, the words now flowing with a fond sadness that was healing, not paralyzing. He listened with a focus that made her feel like she was the only person in the world, his hand often finding hers, their fingers lacing together as if they were made to fit. Yet, his world, the real and dangerous one, was never far away. It lingered in the presence of Silas, whose watchful gaze had softened from suspicion to protective vigilance. It whispered in the hushed phone calls Dante would take, his voice turning hard and clipped before he would consciously soften his expression upon returning to her. Grace was no longer an outsider looking in through a cracked door, she was now standing in the antechamber, aware of the storms raging outside but sheltered within the eye, protected by the very man who commanded the tempest. She saw the weight he carried, the impossible decisions that lined his face, and her understanding deepened from fascination into a profound, protective love. She was not in love with a dangerous man despite his darkness, she was in love with the man who carried that darkness so that those he loved could live in the light. The peace, however, was a delicate illusion, a beautiful soap bubble destined to be popped by the sharp edge of reality. It happened on a crisp afternoon. Grace was in the mansion's library, looking for a book to read to Arya, when Silas found her, his expression grim. "There is a ice situation, Miss Grace," he said, his voice low and urgent. "It would be best if you remained in this wing of the house." Before she could ask questions, she heard the raised voices from Dante's study, the tone vastly different from the controlled meeting she had once witnessed. This was raw, angry, and laced with threat. She couldn't make out the words, but she didn't need to. The meaning was clear, their sanctuary had been breached. The rival Dante had spoken of in vague terms was no longer a theoretical threat. The balance of his dangerous world had been upset, and the tremors were shaking the very foundations of their newfound heaven. Later, Dante found her sitting by the window in the library, her knees drawn to her chest. The mask of the calm, controlled Don was gone, replaced by a weary, grim resolve. He did not try to lie to her. "My association with you has been noted," he stated, his voice heavy. "There are those who see a vulnerability now. A weakness they believe they can exploit. To get to me, they would not hesitate to target what I care for." The unspoken words, what I love hung between them, more powerful for being left unsaid. "For your safety, Grace, it may be best if we create distance." The words were a physical blow, a cold dread that seeped into her bones. This was the consequence she had been warned about. This was the price of loving Dante Vescari. But as she looked at him, at the genuine torment in his eyes, the fear that had gripped her heart transformed into a fierce, unyielding courage. She stood up, walking to him until she was standing directly before him, her head held high. "No," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering, filled with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You told me you built these walls to keep the world out. Don't you see? I am not part of that world you need to keep out. I am part of this world, the one you built inside these walls. The one with Arya's laughter and your love. I am not a weakness, Dante. Let me be your strength. I am not afraid." She watched as her words broke through his resolve. The grim line of his mouth softened. The storm in his eyes cleared, replaced by a look of awe, of reverence. In that moment, she was not just the gentle teacher he was fascinated by, she was his equal, his partner, his queen. He pulled her into her embrace that was both desperate and tender, a silent vow passed from his heart to hers. The resolution of the threat was something she was spared from witnessing directly. Dante handled it with the ruthless efficiency that was his nature, but this time, it was different. It was not about expanding power or instilling fear, it was about protection, about securing their future, a final, decisive act to carve out a permanent space for peace. When it was over, the change in the atmosphere of the mansion was palpable. The tension that had always thrummed just beneath the surface was gone, replaced by a profound and lasting calm. Weeks later, Grace stood in the mansion's garden, no longer a fortress but a true home. Arya was chasing fireflies, her laughter echoing under the twilight sky. Dante came to stand beside her, his arm slipping around her waist, pulling her close. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The journey had been perilous, a descent into a hell of danger and grief, but it had led them here, to this quiet heaven they had built together. He had shown her that desire was not just a feeling, but a choice to embrace life in all its terrifying, passionate intensity. And in doing so, he had not just given her love, he had given her back herself. Their story began in the shadows, but their love demanded the light. If you were captivated by Grace and Dante's journey, if you felt your heart race as they risked everything for a love that defied their worlds, then you cannot miss what comes next. Subscribe now, because their heaven is only just beginning, and the next chapter promises a passion even deeper and a bond even stronger. Don't miss a single moment of their unforgettable story.